My name is Michael Reynolds, and my journey is one of transformation, faith, and self-discovery. I never imagined that my life would take the turns it did, nor that I would be standing here today sharing my story with you. But as I reflect on the past, I realize that every step, every hardship, and every doubt brought me to this moment. I grew up in a small town, where life was simple but filled with struggles. My family worked hard to make ends meet, and from a young age I understood the value of perseverance. Yet deep inside, I felt something was missing. I longed for purpose, a higher calling, something that would give meaning to my existence. That longing led me to a path I never expected. A chance encounter introduced me to a new belief system, one that promised fulfillment, direction, and a sense of belonging. I was captivated. I embraced it wholeheartedly, dedicating myself to its teachings and community. It gave me hope, structure, and a vision for the future. But as the years passed, cracks began to form. What once seemed like unwavering truth started to raise questions in my heart. The expectations, the sacrifices, and the pressures began to weigh on me. Was I truly serving a higher purpose, or was I merely conforming to an institution that dictated my every step? This is the story of how I found faith, lost myself, and eventually discovered the truth that set me free. It is a journey of obedience, questioning, and ultimately, breaking free from the chains that held me captive. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever questioned your own beliefs, or if you're searching for something deeper, then I invite you to walk this path with me. Because the answers we seek are not always where we expect them to be. It all started on an ordinary afternoon, one of those days that seem no different from the rest. I was walking through the marketplace, the air filled with the scent of fresh bread and the sound of distant chatter. My mind wandered, lost in thoughts of routine and repetition. That was when I noticed them. Two young men dressed impeccably, their expressions calm yet purposeful. They approached me with confidence, their presence commanding attention. "Have you ever thought about your purpose in life?" one of them asked. Their words struck a chord within me. It was a question I had asked myself countless times but never truly answered. They handed me a small pamphlet, its pages filled with images of families, unity, and a promise of something greater. They spoke of faith, of divine guidance, and of a community that embraced those who sought the truth. Something inside me stirred. For years I had felt like a wanderer, moving through life without direction. Their words felt like an invitation, a call to something more meaningful than the mundane existence I had known. I hesitated, but curiosity overpowered doubt. "There's a meeting tonight," one of them said. "Come and see for yourself." That evening, I found myself standing in front of a modest building, its lights glowing warmly against the evening sky. I could hear voices inside, a harmony of laughter and deep conversation. Stepping through the door, I was greeted by a warmth I had never known. The room was filled with people, their eyes bright with conviction. A speaker stood at the front, his voice resonating with passion as he spoke about faith, destiny, and the purpose we all carried within us. I listened intently, every word sinking into my soul like a seed waiting to bloom. As the night went on, I felt a strange mixture of emotions, excitement, curiosity, and an unshakable sense that I had found something I didn't even know I was looking for. The people around me shared stories of transformation, of struggles overcome, of lives renewed through unwavering faith. They spoke with certainty, with an assurance that left little room for doubt. "This is the path," the speaker said. "A life dedicated to something greater than yourself." The idea was intoxicating. For the first time, I felt as if my life had meaning. When the gathering ended, an elderly woman approached me. Her eyes were kind, her hands weathered with time. "You remind me of myself when I first came here," she said softly. "I was searching for something and I found it within these walls. If you open your heart, you will find it too." Her words stayed with me long after I left that night. I lay awake, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be. Had I truly found my purpose? Was this the path I was meant to follow? I returned the next day, drawn by an invisible force I couldn't explain. The leaders welcomed me as if I had always belonged. They spoke of discipline, faith, and the power of commitment. They told me that my doubts were natural, but that faith was the answer. "Trust in the journey," they said. And I did. I surrendered myself to their teachings, embracing the path laid before me with unwavering dedication. Little did I know that path would test me in ways I never could have imagined. The days that followed were unlike anything I had experienced before. My old routine faded into the background, replaced by a life filled with purpose, structure, and devotion. Every morning I woke with a sense of duty, eager to immerse myself in the teachings that had begun to shape my new reality. The community welcomed me with open arms, reinforcing the idea that I had found my true home. The more I listened, the more I believed that I was finally part of something greater than myself. The teachings were clear and direct. There was no room for doubt, only faith. The leaders spoke with authority, their voices filled with certainty. "You have been chosen," they would say, their words planting deep roots within my soul. I wanted to believe it. I needed to believe it. The idea that I had been handpicked for something divine was intoxicating. It made every sacrifice, every moment of uncertainty, feel like a necessary step toward enlightenment. As my involvement grew, so did my responsibilities. I attended meetings, participated in rituals, and dedicated countless hours to studying sacred texts. The expectations placed upon me were high, but I accepted them without question. Every rule, every directive was presented as an act of faith, a test of my devotion. And so, I obeyed, without hesitation, without doubt. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But deep within me, small questions began to stir. Why were some teachings emphasized more than others? Why did faith require unquestioning obedience? Why did doubt feel like a sin? I pushed these thoughts away, convincing myself that they were nothing more than distractions sent to test my resolve. Faith is not about questioning, one of the leaders told me. It is about surrender. And I wanted nothing more than to surrender fully. I distanced myself from my past. Old friendships faded, replaced by relationships within the community. My family, once my greatest source of support, became an afterthought. They won't understand, I was told. Not yet, but in time, they will see the truth. And so, I withdrew. I convinced myself that this was the cost of true faith, that sacrifice was necessary for salvation. It was a price I was willing to pay. Looking back, I see now how subtly the changes took place. It didn't feel like control. It felt like guidance. It didn't feel like manipulation. It felt like love. Every step deeper into the faith felt like progress, like ascension. I didn't realize that with each decision I made, a part of me was slowly disappearing, and by the time I recognized it, I was already too far in to turn back. The transformation was complete. I was no longer Michael Reynolds, the boy from a small town with questions and dreams of his own. I was now a servant of a higher calling, molded by the hands of those who claimed to know the path to salvation. I believed it, I lived it, and soon, I would be tested in ways I never anticipated. With each passing day, my responsibilities within the community grew. What started as simple acts of devotion soon evolved into leadership roles. I was given tasks that carried significance, guiding new members, organizing gatherings, and spreading the message to those still outside. It felt like a privilege, an honor to be trusted with such duties. But with that honor came pressure, an unspoken weight that settled onto my shoulders. The expectations were clear. I had to be an example of unwavering faith. Every action, every word was scrutinized. Mistakes were unacceptable, doubts were dangerous. "You are a beacon," the leaders would say. "Others will follow your light." The responsibility was immense. I couldn't afford to falter. I couldn't afford to question. I had to be perfect. Behind closed doors, I struggled. I felt the strain of constantly proving my devotion, of suppressing my own thoughts in favor of the doctrine I had been given. There were moments when I wanted to step back, to breathe, to think for myself. But those moments were fleeting. If I hesitated, if I showed weakness, I would be failing not just myself, but everyone around me. And so, I buried those thoughts deep within, locking them away where they couldn't betray me. The deeper I went, the more I began to understand the price of belonging. Faith was not just about belief, it was about sacrifice. My time, my energy, my individuality, everything was given in service of the mission. There was no room for personal desires, no space for self-interest. Everything I did had to be for the greater purpose. Anything less was considered selfish. The leaders reminded us constantly that we were chosen, that we were privileged to be part of this path. And I believed them. I told myself that this was what I wanted, that my happiness was secondary to the mission. After all, What was happiness if not a fleeting distraction? True fulfillment, I was taught, came only through complete surrender. And so, I smiled. I reassured others. I played my part flawlessly. But inside, something was beginning to shift. A whisper, faint but persistent, telling me that something wasn't right. That faith should not feel like a burden. That love should not require suffering. That perhaps, just perhaps, I was living someone else's truth, not my own. The first cracks in my conviction appeared in the form of a conversation with my mother. She had watched from a distance as I changed, as I drifted further from the life we once shared. She had tried to be supportive, but her concern had grown too great to remain silent. One evening, she sat me down, her eyes filled with something I didn't want to acknowledge. Worry. "Michael," she said softly, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Are you happy?" The question took me by surprise. Of course I was happy, wasn't I? I had found my purpose. I was on the right path. I was doing everything I had been taught was necessary for salvation. But as I opened my mouth to answer, I hesitated. I searched for the certainty that had once been effortless, but for the first time, it eluded me. She watched me carefully, waiting for my response. When I finally spoke, my words felt rehearsed, like lines from a script I had memorized. "This is where I'm meant to be," I told her. "This is what God wants for me." She nodded, but the sadness in her eyes didn't fade. "I just want you to be sure," she said. "Not because they tell you to be, but because you truly are." Her words haunted me long after our conversation ended. I had never doubted my faith. Not truly. But for the first time, I began to wonder if my belief was my own or if it had been given to me, shaped by hands other than my own. But doubt was dangerous. Doubt was the enemy. And so, I pushed it away. Or at least I tried to. There was a moment when I realized that my faith was no longer just about belief. It had become a performance. Every day I lived under a microscope, watched by those who expected nothing less than complete devotion. I couldn't afford to make mistakes, to show weakness, or to express doubt. Perfection was the standard, and anything less was seen as a sign of spiritual failure. The pressure was immense, but I convinced myself that it was a test. That if I endured, I would be rewarded. That if I stumbled, I was simply not strong enough. I remember the first time I truly felt the weight of this expectation. I was leading a study session, speaking about faith and commitment, when a young man raised his hand. His voice was hesitant, his words careful. "What if I have doubts?" he asked. The room fell silent, all eyes turning toward me. I had been taught how to respond to moments like these. Doubt was not to be entertained. It was to be conquered. "Faith is not about having all the answers," I told him, repeating the words I had been given. "It's about trusting even when you don't understand." But as I spoke, I felt a sinking sensation in my chest. I had doubts too. I just didn't dare to admit them. That night, I lay awake, replaying the moment in my mind. I had silenced his question, just as I had silenced my own countless times before. But why? Wasn't faith supposed to be about seeking truth? About asking hard questions and searching for real answers? The contradiction gnawed at me, but I refused to acknowledge it. I told myself that doubt was a sign of weakness, that my struggle was proof that I needed to surrender more, to trust more, to obey more. And so, I buried my thoughts deeper, afraid of what they might reveal. But the more I tried to ignore them, the louder they became. I started to notice things I had never questioned before. The way certain leaders spoke with absolute authority, as if their words were divine. The way the community expected unwavering obedience, as if doubt were a disease. The way people who questioned too much were slowly pushed aside, treated as if they were lost souls rather than individuals seeking understanding. I had been blind to it before. Now, I couldn't unsee it. Despite everything, I still wanted to believe. I wanted to hold on to the certainty I had once felt. But certainty is a fragile thing. Once doubt enters, it spreads like cracks in glass, impossible to ignore. I began to wonder if I was the only one struggling, if others felt the same pressure, the same burden, but were just better at hiding it. And if that was true, then what did it mean for everything I had built my life upon? I had spent years convincing myself that I was on the right path, that my sacrifices had meaning, that my suffering had purpose. But what if I had been wrong? The thought terrified me. If I admitted it, if I allowed myself to question everything, then what would be left? Who would I be? I wasn't ready for those answers. Not yet. So I did what I had always done. I suppressed my doubts, buried them deep, and told myself to have faith. But faith built on fear is not faith at all. It is control. And soon, I would learn just how deep that control ran. It was a simple moment that changed everything. One sentence, spoken in a room full of people, that shattered the illusion I had worked so hard to maintain. We were gathered for a sermon, listening to one of the senior leaders speak about devotion. His words were powerful, his voice unwavering. But then, he said something that sent a chill down my spine. True faith means surrendering everything. Your time, your thoughts, your life. You do not belong to yourself. You belong to the mission. The words echoed in my mind long after the sermon ended. You do not belong to yourself. I had never questioned this idea before. I had given up everything willingly, believing that my sacrifices were part of something greater. But for the first time, I heard those words differently. They no longer sounded like devotion. They sounded like ownership, like control. And for the first time, I wondered if I had truly chosen this life, or if it had been chosen for me. I tried to push the thought away, to convince myself that I was overreacting. But once you start seeing the cracks, you can't stop. I began to notice how carefully the teachings were structured, how every sermon reinforced the idea that obedience was the highest virtue. There was no room for personal interpretation, no space for individual thought. Everything was dictated. Everything was controlled, and I had never even realized it. The next few weeks were some of the hardest of my life. I was still deeply entrenched in the community, still playing the role of the devoted follower. But inside, I was unraveling. I started asking questions, not out loud, but in my own mind. What happens if I leave? Will I still be the same person? Do I even know who I am outside of this? The fear was paralyzing. The teachings had always warned against leaving. Those who walked away were lost. They were doomed. And I had believed it. But what if that wasn't true? The thought alone felt like a betrayal. But it was there, growing stronger by the day. I began to see the patterns, the ways in which control was maintained. The fear of the outside world, the constant reinforcement that doubt was dangerous, the idea that leaving meant losing everything, your community, your purpose, your identity. It was a system designed to keep people in, and I had never questioned it. Until now, I started to realize that faith should not be about fear. It should not require the erasure of self. And yet, that was exactly what I had done. I had erased myself in the name of faith, given up my own thoughts, my own dreams, my own autonomy, and for what? A promise of something greater, a future I had never seen. The questions burned inside me, demanding answers, but I was still too afraid to say them out loud. I told myself I just needed more time, that maybe I was going through a phase, a temporary struggle that would pass. But deep down, I knew the truth. Once you start questioning, you can never truly go back. And soon, I would have to make a choice. I remember the exact moment when everything changed. It was a conversation, much like any other, but this time, I spoke a truth I had never dared to say before. I was sitting with a close friend, someone I had trusted for years. We were discussing faith, commitment, and obedience, the same things we always talked about. But then, I hesitated, and instead of repeating the words I had been taught, I asked the question that had been haunting me for months. What if we're wrong? The room fell silent. My friend stared at me, his expression unreadable. I could see the battle in his mind, the conflict between loyalty and honesty. For a moment, I thought he might answer, that he might confess that he too had wondered the same thing. But then, his expression hardened. "You shouldn't ask questions like that," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Doubt is the first step toward losing everything." I wanted to argue, to say that questions weren't dangerous, that truth should withstand scrutiny. But I saw the fear in his eyes, and I realized that he wasn't warning me. He was afraid for me, afraid of what might happen if others heard my doubts, afraid of what it meant if I no longer believed. And in that moment, I understood something terrifying. Faith should not require fear. Truth should not require silence. And yet, that was exactly what I had been taught. And for the first time, I knew that I had to find my own way. From the moment I allowed myself to ask the question, what if we're wrong? Everything changed. The walls that had once felt like protection now felt like a prison. The words I had once repeated with certainty now felt hollow. But I couldn't say any of this out loud. Not yet. So I fought a silent battle within myself, trapped between the life I had built and the truth I could no longer ignore. I continued my duties as if nothing had changed. I led meetings, preached sermons, and encouraged others to deepen their faith. Outwardly, I was the same devoted believer I had always been. But inside, I was unraveling. Every time I spoke about surrender, about obedience, about trust, a voice in the back of my mind whispered, "Do you even believe this anymore?" I tried to silence it, but it grew louder with every passing day. I avoided discussing my doubts with anyone else. I had learned from my last conversation. Questioning was dangerous. It set off alarms. It made people suspicious. So, I kept my thoughts to myself, playing the role I had spent years perfecting. But pretending to believe something you no longer trust is exhausting. Every sermon drained me. Every conversation felt like a performance. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make myself feel what I had once felt. Late at night, when the world was quiet, I let myself be honest. I would sit alone in my room staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had ended up here. How had I given up so much of myself for something I no longer believed in? The realization was terrifying. My entire life had been built on this foundation. If it crumbled, what would be left? Who would I be? I had spent so long being part of something greater. Was I even capable of existing outside of it? Fear kept me trapped. Fear of losing my community, my purpose, my identity. The teachings had been clear. Those who walked away were lost. They became outcasts, abandoned by the people they once called family. And I wasn't ready for that. So I told myself I just needed time. That maybe, if I kept going, the doubt would fade. That if I just prayed harder, read more, tried more, I could regain what I had lost. But deep down, I knew the truth. Faith should not require pretending. It should not be something you have to force. And no matter how much I wanted to believe again, I couldn't make myself forget the questions that had taken root inside me. They were there to stay, demanding answers I wasn't sure I was ready to find. And sooner or later, I would have to stop running from them. The silent battle couldn't last forever. A choice was coming, and once I made it, there would be no turning back. It happened in a way I never expected. A moment so small, so seemingly insignificant, yet it was the final crack in the foundation I had spent years protecting. It was a meeting, like any other. The room was filled with familiar faces, people I had prayed with, cried with, trusted. The leader spoke about sacrifice, how true faith required giving up everything for the mission. And then, he said something that sent a chill down my spine. You do not belong to yourself. Your thoughts are not your own. Your desires are distractions. The only way to be truly saved is to give everything, your time, your mind, your soul. I had heard similar words before, but this time I truly heard them. And for the first time, they did not feel like guidance. They felt like control. My entire life, I had been told that obedience was the highest virtue, that questioning was rebellion, that sacrifice was proof of devotion. But sitting there, surrounded by people who nodded in agreement, I felt a weight I could no longer ignore. I looked around the room searching for a sign that someone else felt what I felt, that someone else saw the same warning signs. But their faces were calm, their eyes filled with certainty. They believed every word. And for the first time, I realized that I didn't. The fear hit me instantly. If I no longer believed, then what was I doing here? Who was I, if not the person I had always been? Leaving wasn't just about walking away from a group. It was about walking away from everything I had ever known. And that kind of loss felt impossible to bear. But the alternative was worse. Staying meant continuing to live a lie, to silence my own thoughts, to suppress every instinct that told me something wasn't right. And if faith required that, then maybe it wasn't faith at all. Maybe it was something else, something built on fear rather than truth. I left the meeting that night knowing that I had crossed a line. There was no going back. I had seen too much, understood too much. I could not pretend anymore. The moment of decision had come. And no matter how much it scared me, I knew what I had to do. I had to leave. Leaving was not as simple as walking out the door. It was a process, a battle between what I had been taught and what I now knew to be true. The fear was overwhelming. What if they were right? What if leaving meant losing everything? What if I was making the biggest mistake of my life? The questions haunted me, but for the first time, I allowed myself to consider another possibility. What if leaving wasn't the mistake? What if staying was? Once I allowed that thought to take root, the walls that had trapped me for so long began to crumble. I started to see the ways I'd been conditioned to believe that obedience was love, that sacrifice was virtue, that fear was faith. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't pretend anymore. But leaving meant consequences. The community did not take kindly to those who walked away. I had seen it before. People who left were labeled as lost, deceived, traitors to the faith. I knew what awaited me, and yet the thought of staying, of continuing to live a life that no longer felt like my own, was worse. So I made a plan. I started to distance myself, little by little. I stopped attending every meeting, avoided deep conversations, kept my thoughts to myself. But they noticed. They always noticed. The questions came quickly. Is everything okay? Are you struggling? Do you need guidance? I gave vague answers, trying to avoid suspicion. But deep down, I knew the confrontation was coming. When the moment arrived, I was ready. I sat in front of the leader I had once admired, the man whose words had shaped my entire worldview, and I told him the truth. I need to leave, I said. His face remained calm, but I could see the shift in his eyes, concern, disappointment, and then something colder, control. You know what happens to those who walk away, he said. You will lose everything, your purpose, your family, your future. His words hit me like a hammer. The fear rose inside me, threatening to pull me back. But then I realized something. If this was truly a place of love, then why was leaving met with threats? If this was truly a path of faith, then why was fear the thing keeping me here? And in that moment I knew. I stood up, I walked away, and for the first time in years, I felt free. Walking away was the hardest thing I had ever done. I had expected freedom to feel like a weight lifting from my shoulders, but in the days that followed, all I felt was fear. The teachings had been clear. Leaving meant isolation. It meant losing my purpose, my support, my entire world. And now that I had stepped outside, I was terrified that they had been right. The silence was the worst part. My phone, once constantly buzzing with messages and calls, now sat still. No invitations to meetings, no check-ins from people who once called me family. It was as if I had vanished overnight. I had known this would happen, but nothing could prepare me for the emptiness it left behind. I had spent years surrounded by people who told me they loved me, but their love, I realized now, had come with conditions. And the moment I stopped following the rules, it disappeared. I found myself questioning everything. Had I made a mistake? Had I been too impulsive? Maybe if I had just tried harder, prayed more, surrendered completely, I could have silenced my doubts and stayed. But then, I reminded myself of the truth. I hadn't left because I was weak. I had left because I could no longer ignore the voice inside me telling me something wasn't right. And no matter how painful it was, I knew I had done the right thing. Still, the loneliness was unbearable. I had spent so long being part of something that now, standing on my own, I felt like I was floating in an empty void. I had no sense of direction, no idea what came next. For so long, every choice I made had been dictated by the teachings, the leaders, the community. Now for the first time, I was the only one responsible for my life, and that terrified me. At night, I would lie awake, haunted by memories of the past. The friendships, the moments of joy, the certainty that had once filled my heart. It was easy to remember the good and forget the bad. Easy to wonder if maybe, just maybe, I should have stayed. But deep down, I knew that was fear talking. I had left for a reason, and I had to trust that even if I didn't know what lay ahead, it was better than continuing to live a lie. But knowing that didn't make it easier. I was alone, and for the first time I had to figure out who I was beyond the walls of the life I had left behind. And that, I realized, was the real challenge. Fear had controlled me for so long that I didn't know how to live without it. It had been woven into every part of my existence. Fear of failure, fear of doubt, fear of leaving, fear of the unknown. And now, standing on the other side, I was still afraid. But this fear was different. It wasn't the kind that chained me to a belief system. It was the fear of starting over, of rediscovering myself after years of living someone else's truth. I didn't know where to begin. I had spent so long being told what to believe that now, faced with the freedom to think for myself, I felt lost. What if I made the wrong choices? What if I failed? The teachings had been clear. Without them, I was nothing. But was that really true? Or had I just been conditioned to believe it? I started small. I allowed myself to explore ideas that had once been forbidden. I read books from perspectives I had never considered, watched documentaries about people who had walked a path similar to mine. At first, it felt like betrayal. The guilt was overwhelming. Every time I questioned what I had been taught, I could hear their voices in my head. You're being deceived. You're falling into darkness. You will regret this. But the more I explored, the more I realized something incredible. I wasn't falling into darkness. I was stepping into light. For the first time, I was thinking for myself. I was forming my own beliefs, making my own choices. And with every step, the fear lost a little more of its power. That's not to say it disappeared entirely. There were still moments when doubt crept in, when I wondered if I had made the wrong decision. But instead of running from those thoughts, I faced them. I allowed myself to ask questions, to challenge the beliefs I had once accepted without hesitation. And what I found was something no one had ever told me before. Truth doesn't fear questions. If something is truly right, it will stand up to scrutiny. I had spent years being afraid of doubt. But now, I realized that doubt wasn't the enemy. It was the key to finding my own path. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid to walk it. The process of rebuilding myself was slow. I had spent so long being defined by my faith that I didn't know who I was outside of it. Every choice felt unfamiliar, every step uncertain. But for the first time, they were my choices. And that made all the difference. I started by reconnecting with people I had pushed away. Old friends, family members I had distanced myself from. Some welcomed me back with open arms, relieved that I had finally seen the truth. Others were more hesitant, wary of the person I had become. I couldn't blame them. I had spent years judging them for not believing what I believed. Now the roles were reversed and I had to prove that I wasn't the same person anymore. Rebuilding those relationships was difficult. There were apologies to be made, wounds to be healed. But with time, I began to realize that love should not come with conditions. The people who truly cared about me had never required me to fit into a mold. They had accepted me for who I was, even when I had not done the same for them. And that realization was both humbling and freeing. Beyond relationships, I had to figure out what I truly believed. Did I still believe in God? In faith? Or had I only believed because I had been told to? The answers didn't come easily. Some days, I felt like I had lost everything, like I was drifting without purpose. But other days, I felt something new: peace. Because for the first time, I was allowing myself to find my own truth. There were still challenges. The community I had left behind had not forgotten me. Some reached out, trying to convince me to return. Others ignored me entirely, treating me as if I had never existed. And while that hurt, I reminded myself that their love had always been conditional. I didn't need their approval to move forward. So I took each day as it came, learning, growing, rebuilding. It wasn't easy. It wasn't instant. But it was real. And for the first time, I wasn't living for someone else. I was living for me. Something changed the day I stopped feeling ashamed of my journey. For so long, I had carried my past like a weight, a burden I was afraid to acknowledge. I had been conditioned to believe that leaving was a failure, that questioning was weakness, that doubt was something to be hidden. But the more I embraced my truth, the more I realized something powerful. My story was not one of failure. It was one of strength. I had survived something most people never experience. I had walked away from a system that had shaped my entire identity. I had faced the fear of the unknown, the loss of everything I once held dear. And yet, I was still here. I was still standing. And that, I realized, was something to be proud of. But it wasn't just about me. As I began to share my experience with others, I discovered something I never expected. I was not alone. There were so many others who had been through the same struggle, who had faced the same doubts, the same fear, the same isolation. Some were still trapped, afraid to take the first step. Others had walked away but didn't know how to rebuild. And when they heard my story, they saw something they hadn't before: hope. For the first time, I saw my pain as something more than just personal suffering. It was a bridge, a way to connect with others who needed to hear that they were not alone, that it was possible to leave and still find happiness, that life did not end outside of the walls we had once believed in. And that realization gave my journey a new purpose. I started writing, speaking, sharing my experience in any way I could. At first, it was terrifying. I had spent so long being told to stay silent that using my voice felt unnatural. But the more I spoke, the more I realized how important it was. Every time someone told me that my story had helped them, that they saw themselves in my words, that they finally felt understood, I knew I was doing the right thing. Owning my story gave me power. It turned my pain into something meaningful. And for the first time, I no longer felt like a victim of my past. I felt like someone who had taken control of their own life, someone who had broken free, someone who could help others do the same. Because the truth is, freedom is not just about leaving a place, it's about reclaiming your voice. And that is exactly what I had done. Leaving had felt like the end of everything I knew. But now, standing on the other side, I realized something incredible. It wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The start of a life that was truly mine, shaped not by fear or obligation, but by choice. For the first time, I was free to be whoever I wanted to be. And that was the most powerful realization of all. I no longer felt lost. The questions that had once terrified me now excited me. What did I believe? What kind of life did I want to build? Who did I want to become? These were no longer questions that filled me with fear. They were possibilities. And for the first time, I wasn't looking to anyone else for answers. I was finding them within myself. I had been told that without the community, I would be nothing, that I would be broken, empty, without purpose. But they had been wrong, because outside of the system that had once controlled me, I found something I had never truly known before: peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from obedience, but from knowing that you are living your truth. That doesn't mean the journey was easy. There were still challenges, still moments of doubt, still scars that had not fully healed. But now, I faced them with a strength I never knew I had, because I had walked through the fire and come out the other side. And nothing, no amount of fear or doubt could take that away from me. Looking back, I wouldn't change a thing, because every step, every struggle, every painful moment led me to this one, the moment where I could finally say that I was free. Free to think, to believe, to live without fear. Free to define my own purpose, my own path, my own life. And that was worth everything I had lost. To anyone who has ever felt trapped, who has ever doubted, who has ever been afraid to leave, I want you to know something. You are not alone. You are stronger than you think. And no matter what they tell you, no matter how impossible it seems, there is life beyond the walls they built around you. A life that is yours to create. This is my story. But it is only the beginning. Because the most powerful thing I have learned is this: freedom is not just about walking away. It is about moving forward. And that is exactly what I intend to do. Looking back, I can see that every step of my journey, every doubt, every fear, every painful moment, was leading me to the truth. The truth that faith should not be built on fear, that love should not come with conditions, that obedience should not replace self-discovery, and most importantly, that no one has the right to control your thoughts, your choices, or your soul. Walking away was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was also the most important, because in leaving, I didn't lose myself. I found myself. I discovered that my worth is not determined by my ability to conform, that my purpose is not something dictated by others, that my relationship with God, with faith, with truth, is something deeply personal, something no institution can define for me. If you are struggling, if you feel trapped, if you are afraid of what lies beyond the walls you've always known, I want you to hear me. There is life beyond fear. There is faith beyond control. There is freedom beyond obedience. And you are not alone in this journey. You are stronger than you realize. And no matter what they tell you, You have the right to seek the truth for yourself. So I invite you to take that step, to question, to seek, to discover what faith and truth really mean for you. Because the moment you stop living in fear is the moment you truly start living. And if my story has shown you anything, I hope it has shown you this. Freedom is possible, and it is worth everything. If this message resonated with you, if you have felt the weight of control and longed for something more, then I encourage you, subscribe to this channel and follow the only truth that truly sets us free. Follow Jesus, because he does not demand blind obedience. He does not use fear as a tool. He calls us to love, to truth, to a faith that is real, not forced. And if you're ready to take that step, to walk in true freedom, then I would be honored to walk this path with you. Thank you for being here, for listening, for opening your heart to this message. You are not alone. You are valued, you are loved, and you have a purpose greater than you've ever imagined. And no matter where you are in your journey, I hope you know that you will always have a place here. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and never stop seeking the truth.